Algunos me han escrito correos, espero responderlos entre hoy y mañana. Good morning, everyone. Today we will see differences between fragility, robustness, and antifragility. So this is a bit of a continuation of previous classes because it's related to many of the concepts that we've seen. Let me share this screen. And okay. So we will speak about each of these three: fragility, robustness, and antifragility in turn. We will see examples about studies of robustness and antifragility in random Boolean networks. So last week we saw briefly a model of random Boolean networks. It's an abstract computational model inspired initially by genetic regulatory networks, but they have been used in many other contexts. I mean, they're very general, and they have become good tools to study the relationship between structure and function, because we can ask ourselves, how can we change, or what are the effects that the change in the structure, basically in the topology of the network, will have on the function, which can also be represented as a network, but the state network. And we saw that there are three dynamical regimes: order, chaotic, and critical. And each of these has its own properties. And then these dynamical regimes are, of course, aspects of the function of the network. So then the question is, how can we guide the self-organization of these dynamics towards a desired regime? And it doesn't necessarily have to be criticality. If we want something to be chaotic or ordered, then we can use the same ideas and same concepts to drive the dynamics in that direction. So this also to review some of the concepts that we saw in the first classes. In order to cope with complexity, we can do different complementary things. One is to adapt, and adapting, seen in a very general way, can be seen as a change in the system to cope with the change in its environment. And learning, evolution, development can be seen as types of adaptation, and it's related to feedback control in cybernetics. Anticipation, it's similar, only that we want to make a change in the system before the perturbation affects the system. You could see it as one type of adaptation, but it's usually seen as a separate mechanism, and it's related with cognition. I mean, basically, much of what cognition does is trying to anticipate what will be the effects of changes in the environment of the organism. Why? Because some of these changes might be harmful for the organism, so you want to maintain or sustain the individuality, and therefore, if you are able to predict, you have this anticipation, you will be better fit to survive. This is related to feed-forward control in cybernetics, and we mentioned, but today we will see a bit more robustness. We can describe a robust system as one that continues functioning in the presence of perturbations. So basically, perturbations don't affect the function of the system. There can be external changes or internal changes, but the system keeps on doing what it should do. And this is related to buffering in cybernetics. So the first two would be active controllers, and buffering is considered a passive controller, in the sense that the first two require an action or a change within the system, and robustness usually doesn't. So it's just inherent properties of the system that prevent damage. So fragility is something that, let's say, we can identify with, because many things around us and ourselves sometimes can be seen fragile. Of course, it's contextual, because we can ask, for example, whether we are fragile or not. Well, it depends. Fragile against what? So we are fragile against poisons, or outer space, or deep sea. I mean, we cannot survive in those environments, but we are very robust in other contexts, like bullying. I mean, being bullied, we can withstand that without much problem, and many other situations. Being invaded by our neighbors in most countries kind of manage to survive that after some time. But fragility has several analogies with chaos, in the sense that basically a small change can have great effects in the system, usually negative effects. So that's something we would like to prevent in many cases. In other cases, when we wanted to change a system, we would like to make it more fragile. Like we mentioned this already. Like in Mexico, corruption is very robust. So how can we make it more fragile? Or organized crime, it's very robust. How can we make it more fragile? So that's, let's say, change can occur. In general, fragile systems are not selected by evolution, because evolution over long periods of time tends to preserve systems that maintain themselves, and for that you need robustness. So therefore, fragile systems, let's say, they will lose information in time, seeing it in a very general way. So there are different ways of dealing with fragility. I mean, in many cases, we have fragile systems, and then we need to deal with them, like economies. In many cases, they can be fragile to external perturbations. So one way is to protect them. So that this is one of the uses of buffering. So imagine you have a very delicate cups that you want to send by post. So they are fragile because perturbations will break them. So in order to protect them, you put them with a cover. You package them specially. Basically, you put a buffer between the fragile cups and the potential perturbations. And if it's a buffering good enough and the perturbations aren't too high, then the cups won't break. Another option is to change the systems themselves so that they are not so fragile. So instead of having crystal cups, maybe metal cups or plastic cups will be a bit more resistant. So Nassim Taleb, I mean, we'll speak more about him. he calls this having skin in the game, because in many cases, in capitalist countries, people who make the decisions don't have skin in the game, and this has led to the perpetuation of fragile systems. So fragile political systems, fragile economies, fragile social systems, because in many cases, if the system is fragile, then it will not survive. But we have reached a situation where the people making decisions on how the systems will function have almost nothing to lose. So in United States, many big companies, they can fail, like the big banks, and there's this expression that they are too big to fail, because then they will drag the whole economy. So the government just gives them money so that they don't go bankrupt. But then the directives of the banks, I mean, I'm speaking about the 2008 crisis, they just they gave themselves bonuses of millions of dollars while they laid off thousands of people because of the crisis. So of course that doesn't help nor the banks, nor the economy, nor the country. And it's because there aren't mechanisms that kind of reinforce many systems in our society not to be fragile. So, I mean, there are many implications to this. So, robustness is present in many biological systems and at multiple scales. This is a property that evolution tends to select, because it basically, if a system or even information is robust, it means that it doesn't change, so it will permeate through time. So it's difficult to say whether systems survive because they are robust, or it is only robust systems that survive, because they come together, robustness and survivability. However, too much robustness is not desirable either. We'll see about this now. But biological systems are very robust because they have evolved to do so, to survive in environments with perturbations. But engineered systems are not so robust in most cases, because they are designed, let's say, for ideal conditions in many cases, or they are tested under specific contexts, and if you take them out of those contexts, then they break down easily. Of course, there are exceptions, like the internet, and let's say, well, there are few good examples of robust artificial systems, but there are many more examples of fragile artificial systems. Therefore, it's desirable to understand better robustness in order to apply this to the systems we build. And also notice that this is more general than stability, because something stable is something that doesn't change. And being robust doesn't mean that you don't change. It means that changes don't affect you. So it could be that there are lots of changes going on, but the system keeps on working. And also there are different types of perturbation which require different types of robustness: functional, structural, material, informational, and so on. So there are many questions about robustness. Erika Jen edited a book already several years ago that we can ask, and people have been trying to find answers to this. So what are the origins of robustness? How does it evolve? What are the organizational principles? Because it has been shown that redundancy, modularity, neutrality, hierarchy, degeneracy, spatial structure, diversification, and more are principles that promote robustness. So, but the question remains, how are these related? So, for example, what's the relationship between redundancy and hierarchy, or can these be combined and so on? And what's their cost? I mean, meaning we'll see with redundancy, it can be efficient in some cases for some types of perturbation, but it can be very expensive. So you can't afford to have duplicate parts of everything just in case, in many cases. And also the relationship between robustness and evolvability is quite an interesting and open question, and how robustness is related to adaptability and to fitness. It's also relevant. And also when is desirable robustness and when it isn't. So Andreas Wagner has a book on robustness, and he gives several examples, and he has different sections of the book, which are the ones I will mention. So first, several chapters on robustness below the gene level. And he speaks about neutral landscape. So landscape, it's imagine you have a 3D space, and you have two variables which give you two coordinates, and then there's a surface and the height of the surface, which would be the value on the vertical axis. That would be the fitness, or how good a solution determined by the two variables x and y is. So this is a way of visualizing fitness landscapes. Well, precisely that's why they're called landscapes. And of course, these are not restricted to 3 dimensions or 2 dimensions. You can have n dimensions. And in optimization, you are trying to find the best solution, which could be the highest point or the lowest point if you're maximizing or minimizing a function. And in many problems, this is difficult because the landscape is, let's say, almost random. So this is called a rugged landscape. So it's like lots of mountains and canyons and peaks. So how do you navigate that landscape locally in order to find the highest point? It's not trivial. There's a whole field studying this. And one concept in this are neutral networks, which are, well, you can also use landscapes to relate genotype and phenotype. So genotype would be the variables that have a function, and then the phenotype would be the function. And the thing is that, or you can also see the genotype as structure and the phenotype as function. And when you have neutral networks, there are point mutations, so you can make changes in your variables, changes in your structure that will not affect the function. So changes in structure that don't affect the function. Changes in genotype that don't affect the phenotype or the fitness of the phenotype. Therefore, they're neutral because it's like you have a mountain, and then there's like an edge, and you can go all around the edge, and you are moving in the mountain, but without changing your height or your fitness. So it turns out that in RNA folding, here the genotype would be basically the sequence of nucleotides, adenine, cytosine, guanine, or uracils. I don't know how to pronounce it properly in English. And then you have a sequence of these 4 nucleotides. And let's restrict ourselves to RNA chains of length 1000, let's say. Usually they can be longer easily. Then you have 4 to the 1000 different strings of that length. And more of course, there are many more of different length. But if we restrict ourselves to that, then one could imagine that it's an almost infinite. Well, in practice, it is an infinite space. You can't explore all of this. But it turns out that you have neutral networks all over the space of RNA folding. This means that you can always have point mutations that you change one base, and this will not have an effect on the function, basically the shape in which RNA folds. In other words, you can always have mutations in RNA, and the RNA will synthesize the same protein. So this allows evolution to explore the genotype space without having changes in the phenotype. And not only that, but all phenotype relatively close to redundancy shape space. So something similar happens with proteins and protein folding. So proteins are sequences of amino acids. So there are 20 different ones. So here it's even more the combination of possibilities, because it's 20 to the length of the protein, the number of amino acids. So if it's proteins of length 1,000, 20 to the 1,000, it's huge. But still, their proteins are robust to mutations. They're also modular and similar to RNA in the sense that there are neutral mutations, and you can find, let's say, the proteins fold into similar shapes independently. It seems that any protein, or almost any protein, can have mutations, basically that you change one amino acid and it will fold in the same shape. Therefore, this allows the exploration of the shape space without changing the shapes. Yeah, and then suddenly you will find a mutation that will make a change, and this will have benefits. So maybe there are universal principles or not. That's something that it's an open question. So above the gene level, there are also several examples of robustness. So the development of organisms, how they go from a single cell to billions of cells. It's a very robust process. There's also robustness in metabolic pathways and metabolic networks. So there are different molecules that are involved in metabolic processes, but then if one kind of stops working, usually there are alternative paths so that, let's say, the system is still viable. So also the robustness beyond the organisms, there are several examples in ecology where sometimes there are related concepts that are overlapping with robustness, but simply they're called differently in ecology. So people speak about resilience and about stability, and more recently about sustainability. And all of these are related to robustness. Yeah. So in food webs, usually they are robust, but not always. I mean, since ecosystems evolve, we're in very dynamic situations, meaning that there are changes in temperature, there are changes in abundance of species, then there are invasive species. And I mean, all of these before humans would increase these perturbations. But I mean, that's how ecosystems evolve. So usually food webs are robust in the sense that if, for example, you remove one species or you add a species to the ecosystem, then the ecosystem kind of will manage to adapt to these changes. However, there are species which are called keystone species that if you remove them, then everything collapses. So in many cases, this can be the top predators. So probably you've heard this story about Yellowstone National Park, where they decided that wolves were bad. Probably they heard many times Little Red Riding Hood stories when they were children, and they said, okay, the big bad wolves shouldn't be in this park, let's get rid of them. So they shot all of them, and then it was a mess because wolves control the populations of herbivores. In particular, I forget where, deer or reindeer, or yeah, there shouldn't be moose, they're too big, but deer or reindeer. So their population started exploding, so they started feeding on small trees, so there were no new trees, and then there was more erosion because of this lack of vegetation by the river, and then the river water became less crystalline, so then there were less fishes, and then since there were less fishes, there were less eagles, and since there were, it was like whole change reaction, and everything changed. So then they brought back wolves, and they stabilized the population, and let's say after some time, things got back to the state they were. And the concept of homeostasis, that is usually, well, it was defined by Cannon, who actually, I think Rosenbluth studied with him. In the early 20th century, Cannon defined homeostasis more for the organism, but it can also be applied to ecosystem. And also, there's a book by Peter Chermely on weak links, and basically it's like the complementarity of modularity. If you have modules, then usually modules are joined by weak links, and these weak links increase the robustness of systems, because basically if needed, then they can break so that changes don't propagate through the whole system. And then there are examples of robots in artificial systems. So the World Wide Web, TCP/IP, peer-to-peer systems, ad hoc networks. Usually these are decentralized systems, because if you have centralized systems, then if you chop off the head, let's say the system breaks down. So if you have a distributed system, then you can take out elements, and they will keep on functioning. So, we could speak about robust social systems, or better said, robust organizations. So after 9/11, there were suddenly lots of people terrorism in some circles. So some of that work really was about terrorist networks and how robust they were, because there was not a single leader. So it's difficult to eradicate them, because let's say if you have a hierarchy in an organization, you just capture the leader, or and then let's say they will be headless. No? And traditionally this was the case. You have a general in an army, you aim for the general. That was strategy of Alexander the Great against the Persians. So capture Darius, and then the army doesn't know what to do. But if you have a distributed force where there is little communication between the cells, and actually in some cases many people don't even know who's really in charge, so it's extremely difficult to eradicate. And very similar occurs with criminal organizations. It's not like, El Chapo Guzman is in jail, now there's no more Sinaloa cartel, and Sinaloa cartel keeps on functioning. And also, we could ask ourselves whether how can we design a robust economy? Well, assuming that the economy is fragile because there's suddenly a perturbation, then there are changes, and then they spread all over the globe. And not only the pandemic, I mean, all the economic crises like the dot-com burst and the 2007-8 crises, that it was like an unstable situation that was just propagating all over the global financial system. So people wonder whether we can design our economies in such a way that this doesn't happen. And I mean, not that there are perturbations, but the and Taleb introduced the concept of antifragile in this context, and we will speak about this later. So there have been several studies about robustness in networks. I mean, we already mentioned that networks are useful because to study complex systems, because nodes can be seen as elements, and links can represent interactions. So it is known that, for example, scale-free networks are robust to random attacks. However, they're fragile to direct attacks to hubs. So if you have few important nodes and lots of non-important nodes, if you kind of take out nodes randomly, you know that the probability of hitting an important node is very low. However, if you know which nodes are important and you take those out, then it becomes fragile. So of course, it also depends on what kind of perturbations you're having or what kind of attacks you're receiving. And there are different strategies to improve this fragility. One is to have connections between the hubs. So if one takes out, the others can take over. These are also called Medusa networks, because you have like a head which is well connected, and then from those nodes you have like tentacles. An example of this is the global airport network, which is robust and is scale-free, in the sense that if an airport is shut down, air traffic can continue because they can reroute through other airports. And of course, there are airports that cause more disruption than others if they shut down for whatever reason. But let's say major airports have lots of connections among themselves in Europe, in United States, in China. So yeah, that's one example of this type of networks that are very robust. Road networks are not so robust. They are not scale-free because on average, the highways that connect different cities is more or less the same. So let's say it has like a bell-shaped distribution. There are few cities with few roads. Those would be like somewhere in the mountain that, let's say, there's just one road leading to a little town, and that's it, or maybe two. I mean, most cities have, let's say, 4 or more roads, and then there are very few cities that have lots of roads leading to them. Why? Because you need to go through different cities in order to reach farther cities. I mean, it doesn't make sense to have a highway between Mexico and Monterrey that doesn't cross any other city. And it makes sense to do that for flights, for example. So it's relatively disruptive just to block one highway, as, say, demonstrators tend to do in Mexico. And that will disrupt much more traffic than, let's say, if one airport is closed, because of course you can reroute, but you are affecting. So for example, if the highway to Cuernavaca is shut down, you're affecting not only the traffic between Mexico and Cuernavaca, you are affecting the traffic between Mexico and Chilpancingo and Tequesquitengo and Iguala and Acapulco and Zihuatanejo, and I mean all the cities that to reach them you need to go through that highway. Well, of course there are alternative highways, but then it's a long detour, and all of these cities are affected. So all of the routes are affected. Whereas if, for example, the airport of Acapulco is shut down, then you can still fly to Zihuatanejo, to Huatulco, meaning that it doesn't affect other airports. So other alternatives would be to duplicate hubs, but this might be expensive. And if you have a dynamic network, you can shift the hub. So in a computer network, you could, let's say in many cases, there are servers that are more important than others, but in order to prevent attacks, you can change the important nodes constantly or hide them somehow. So already several years ago, we did a study on the effect of robustness in random Euler networks with Prof. Kaufman and Ilya Shmulevich. So the question is, what happens when redundant nodes are added to a random Euler networks? And understanding robustness as having more than one copy of an element. This is seen in Diploid genomes. So I think that most animals have diploid genomes. I mean, eukaryotes, meaning that we have two copies of genes. Well, no, not eukaryotes, but organisms with sexual reproduction. Because let's say we get one copy from the mother, one copy from the father, and then you have two. But there are also organisms that are haploid. So, for example, non-fertile ants, they're haploid. They just have one strand of genes, and they don't need it because they will not reproduce. And then there are also other combinations. So, for example, some watermelons are tetraploid, so they have 4 strands of DNA. And one way of having seedless watermelons is hybridizing diploid watermelons with tetraploid watermelons, and then the resulting plants will be triploid watermelons, and those are not fertile and they don't have seeds. So next time you enjoy seedless watermelon, probably it's a triploid organism you are consuming. But anyway, I just mean that it's useful to have 2 copies, because if there's a mutation that kind of would be lethal, meaning that a protein is not produced or the wrong protein is produced, then you have another copy that hopefully will do the right function. It is in cases, I mean, many genetic diseases are expressed when a person has both wrong mutations in both genes from both parents, and then let's say it's basically the disease expresses. Then this is rare mostly precisely because of the robustness that diploidy gives us. And also, it seems that growth in genetic regulatory networks is given by duplication and mutation of genes. So you can have one gene, and then you have several copies of that gene. And actually, plants have lots of redundancy in their genes. And there can be mutations in these genes. The necessary points, and so it will be like a neutral mutation, but then sometimes the mutations will lead to the production of a new gene, and then useful. I don't see as a way of smooth landscape with evaluability. However, too much reduce the rate of evolution. So Kaufman proposed a conjecture saying that 1-bit mutations to a minimal program will change drastically the output of the program, making it distinguishable from noise. So the idea of this conjecture is that you need to have a balance between redundancy and evolvability. So you need some redundancy so that not every mutation will change the function, but you need to have the possibility. But the conjecture also says that if you have too much redundancy, then evolution will be very difficult because you will not be able to change and explore new solutions. So again, it's like a more specific expression of the balance between order and chaos. However, it's not really possible to obtain a minimal program because it has been proven that you cannot prove that the program is minimal. So instead of trying to prove this conjecture directly, which you can't, I mean, it's one of these things that you can prove that you cannot prove. But what we can do is to compare networks that are more or less redundant, so that we can show, we can measure, okay, this network is more redundant, and what we can do is to say and there is nothing less than this network, but this is minimal. So things, they're fictitious, so actually there's no difference. We best check the differences of the state spaces with Hamming this, so it's a way of changes. And then the algorithm we propose to generate redundant nodes, we basically select a node, then we let's say this original node, and then we add a redundant node. It will have the same inputs, the same function, the same lookup tables, and the same outputs. But then the outputs, the nodes that have as inputs, the node that was selected now will have also as inputs the new redundant node, and we will expand their lookup table in such a way that if either of these is on, then the function will be the same as the one it had when this was on. So basically, if this turns out to be off, but this is on, then there will be no perturbation. So this is an example for a very small network with 3 nodes and 2 connections each. We select this X node to be redundant. So each one has its lookup table. So then the redundant node will have the same inputs as X, Y, and Z, and the same lookup table, which you see here. And then the outputs of X, which are Z and Y, will get their lookup table expanded because now they will also have as inputs R. And basically this part of the lookup table, when X is 0, will not change. Well, actually, when R is 0, nothing changes. And then when R is 1, you will copy the values when X was 1. So you just copy these 3 times. Well, 2 more times. And the same here. So basically, we also measure the overlap with Hamming distances in the difference of the state space. So if this difference between the state spaces is equal to 0, then they're the same. So the mutation had no effect. And as this ds grows, means that the mutation had a greater effect. So a mutation would be maximally catastrophic when ds is close to 0.5, because if it would be 1, it would mean that they are anticorrelated. And the problem is that this is restricted to small networks. So this some results for small networks, and you see that the ds is reduced as you increase the number of red nodes. But also, since you are growing the lookup tables, the effect will decrease. So we normalize it with ds to the k until you can see that the effect of mutations are reduced as you add more and more red nodes, especially for more chaotic networks. And same for slightly larger networks. And it's similar with scale-free topologies and different updating schemes. So why redundancy helps? Because if a redundant node is mutated, then this will not change the state space because the other node will take over. So we can say that redundancy, useful redundancy smoothens the finite landscapes and increases neutrality. However, if you have too much redundancy, this could make evolutionary research slower because you are making changes and these have no effects. So you are not exploring new possibilities. So if you have already a smooth landscape, then and you want to make an evolutionary search, probably you don't need redundancy because it will become even smoother and it will increase the search. So before moving forward, let me go to the chat. I see there are several questions. So Mauricio asks, can robustness be also thought about in homeostatic systems to think about vulnerability of an organism facing a virus or something? Yes, like that. And Sophia mentions like what happened in Xochimilco. I suppose about invasive species or about the manatees?
About both. I think the story is that Xochimilco was very polluted, and then they introduced this, I don't know how you call it in English, lirio?
Carpas?
Lirio acuático, yeah. And it got spread out.
Water lily.
A lily, thank you. Water lily. So they introduced this to clean the water, I think, but then it spread out all over the place and it started killing other species of fish and animals. And then they introduced the manatee, and locals started killing the manatee, and it was just a mess.
Yeah. Australia is full of such stories.
Oh yeah.
With sugarcane toads and rabbits and rats and yeah. Amari shared an article, Stability of Democracies, a Complex Systems Perspective. In the second section, the authors review the concept of stability, and they compare it with model robustness and introduce some notions of ecological and economical stability to define stability in democracy. Thanks. Heriberto asks, is there any formal association between robustness and entropy? Usually, you can use entropy to measure robustness. Well, actually, the inverse of entropy. So usually the higher entropy you have, the more fragility you have. So it can be used, let's say, as a measure. Yeah. Okay. So returning to Kaufman's conjecture, if you had a random mutation on a, let's call it minimal random Boolean network, but we know we can't build a minimal random Boolean network, then it should produce DS close to 0.5. But then we can say that less compressible random Boolean networks, those without redundant nodes, always have higher DS differences in the state spaces. And the more redundant nodes we add, then the network becomes more compressible, and then DS decreases, and we can see let's say we can say that this is because an increase of robustness. So what we can say is that this is evidence showing that the compressibility is directly proportional to the robustness of networked random mutations. So it favors the conjecture, it doesn't prove it, but it kind of shows that it makes sense. And degeneracy, it's a bit different from redundancy. So Wagner argues that in molecular and genetic networks, degeneracy is more responsible for robustness rather than redundancy, even when you can have both. But then you can have different type of robustness with mechanisms, and these are complementary. And actually, we also studied degeneracy around the Boolean networks, and they have a similar effect. But if you add, let's say, a degenerate node and redundant node, then this increases even more the robustness of the network. So they're complementary. Okay, that moved too fast. So antifragility is a concept that has less than 10 years. So it was proposed by Nassim Taleb in his book, Antifragile. An introduction, he says, well, I was trying to find a concept that was the opposite of fragility. I mean, Taleb was for several years a trader in Wall Street, so his focus is on economic systems, but he also applies it to many other systems. So he asked, okay, what's the opposite of fragility? And most people would say, well, robustness. And he was not convinced, because he said, well, robustness is the absence of fragility. It's basically you don't have an effect of perturbations. But the opposite of fragility, I mean, understanding fragility as something that suffers from perturbations would be something that benefits from perturbations. So he gives the same example of the crystal cups. If you send them by post, you try to protect them and put fragile, do not shake, do not throw, do not smash, because perturbations will destroy the cups. If you send something robust by post, you don't put anything because you don't care how they handle them. Rocks or logs, they will keep their function independently on how they're treated. However, if you send something anti-fragile by post, you would put a label that says, please shake, because the more you shake it, the better it will reach its destination. And this might sound counterintuitive, but let's say there are several examples of antifragility. One would be tamarind water. So if you don't perturb it, basically all the pulp goes down and it doesn't taste good. So you need to shake it and then it's good. So it benefits from perturbations. Immune system also benefits, can also be said to be antifragile. So it is known that if babies are not exposed to pathogens when they are small, their immune systems are not developed, they don't get enough training. So when they grow, they are more prone to have more diseases and stronger symptoms because their immune systems are, let's say, not well developed. And another example is with sport. So when we exercise, our body increases breathing, and therefore there's more oxygen in our blood and reaching our cells. So in principle, this should accelerate aging in our cells because that is given by oxidation. So However, when we exercise, our body produces antioxidants, and this overcompensates the effect of the increased oxygenation. So the overall effect is rejuvenating. And I mean, very probably if you run a marathon every day, then that's already too much and the body cannot compensate, and it's already too much. So it's also a matter of balance. And more generally in medicine, there's concept of hormesis, which basically when you have small doses of something that would be harmful, it turns out to make the organism resistant. So there's this story of people having small doses of arsenic, and this makes them resistant to arsenic, so then they cannot be poisoned with arsenic. Kids don't try this at home. Because of course, if how much is too few arsenic, that will increase this enough and not damage you or kill you. And also there are some research, but it's kind of still not well accepted. So also kids don't try this at home. That if people who are exposed to small doses of radiation, then they reduce their probability of being affected by high doses of radiation, radioactivity. Yeah, so it's still not confirmed, but I think we're far from prescribing, I don't know, kids some radiation treatment so that will reduce the risk of cancer. But who knows? It might work. Just like we do exercise to prevent some aging, maybe small doses of radiation will prevent cancer. It seems it's much more complex than that. But anyway, this concept has been already used to software development. So, for example, in Amazon, you have Chaos Monkey or Symbian Army, which is basically algorithms that start fiddling with your code. And the idea is that you should build a code that is robust enough so that it keeps on working with these perturbations. So instead of eliminating perturbations, you harness them to improve the system. You could say that's the main idea of designing anti-fragile systems. How can the system benefit not in spite of perturbations, but because of perturbations? And which kind of systems thrive with perturbations? And Taleb gives mythological examples of fragility, robustness, and antifragility. So fragility is the Damocles sword. So there is this sword on top of Damocles, and anything will, let's say, small perturbation will destroy the system. I think the robustness metaphor is the phoenix. So basically, it doesn't care if it burns, it just revives from its ashes again. And the analogy for antifragility would be the hydra or hydra. You chop one head and that benefits the hydra because it grows. Was it 2 more or 3 more? I don't remember. But yeah, a hydra benefits from antifragility, from perturbations. That's type of perturbation. So a few years ago with Hyodin Kim and Omar Pineda, we proposed a measure of fragility, antifragility, which is basically multiplying the change in satisfaction. Basically, satisfaction is how well the system performs a function, and multiplying it by the change in the system, basically the perturbation. So here there's for random Mooreland networks, we increase the perturbation, and here we measure the fragility for different connectivities. So here you can see that order networks, you could say that they are antifragile because they benefit from perturbations, but also because we're defining a satisfied network as a critical one, basically one where another measure we propose of complexity is highest or is maximized. So the idea is that basically perturbations kind of, if you remember this phase diagram where you have order dynamics for few connectivity and chaotic dynamics for higher connectivity, the perturbations kind of push you to the right of this diagram. So if you are on the order phase, the perturbation will push you towards criticality. If you are critical, they will push you towards chaos. And if you are chaos, it will be even more chaotic. So this basically, you can see this as you have more perturbations. These curves tend to go up after some time, but also for order networks, let's say they remain antifragile for k equals 2, just for small perturbations, and then they become fragile. And chaotic networks, basically k greater than 2, they're already fragile, and when you have perturbations, they become even more fragile. And this always how often we make perturbations. So. Yeah, so I was mentioning that we see complexity as satisfaction. So this would be the initial complexity and then the final complexity, depending on the perturbation for the different connectivities. And then the difference of complexity is here. So if it's negative, it means that the satisfaction for this region grew with the perturbation because it's more complex. So that's something you want in principle. If we agree that criticality is desirable. And it turns out that biological cells, now there is free data about biological cells. Well, most of these are small, but then you can program them, perturb them, and measure their antifragility. And most of them are antifragile. And actually, it's interesting that the ones that aren't antifragile are those. The most antifragile, it's from the immune system and mammalian. And the one which isn't is from Arabidopsis, which is a plant cell, which has lots of redundancy, and a tumor cell, which you might think that they also want to be able to mutate very fast. So to conclude, the difference between redundancy and antifragility is that redundancy doesn't care about perturbations, and antifragility benefits from perturbations, and fragility is destroyed, is affected negatively by perturbations. More recently, we made another study of antifragility in cryptocurrencies and the stock market, and we saw that the results indicate that some cryptocurrencies tend to be antifragile, but stock market tends to be robust. And it seems because you don't know what would be the size of the perturbation in the stock market. Because basically the optimal antifragility depends on the size of the perturbation that you will have. So you can see it here in this plot. More to the right, you have greater perturbations. Here there are more frequent perturbations. Less frequent perturbations. If I'm mistaken. But anyway, the optimal antifragility will depend on how much perturbation you're having. If you have no perturbation, then you don't need antifragility, and if you have lots of perturbations, then you need lots of antifragility. So there's no like an optimal antifragility independently on how much noise you have. And this is consistent with what we observe in real cells, in biological cells, because each of these cells has environments that have more or less perturbations. And Kaufman always argued that genetic regulatory networks were critical, but still there was some evidence that they were on the order regime close to criticality. And what we found is that when you are precisely in the order regime, not critical, but close to criticality, you are antifragile. Why? Because these networks are not isolated. If you were isolated, then yeah, the best is to be exactly in the phase transition. But since you will have some perturbations, those perturbations will take you more to the right. And if you are already critical, they will take you to chaos. And if you are more towards the order regime, then this will take you to criticality. And of course, how far from criticality will depend on how often or how big the perturbations will be. So it's consistent that the networks or the cells that have more dynamic environments, basically with more perturbations, they are more antifragile than those that have more robust environments. Or it's a bit more complicated. I'm oversimplifying, but yeah, we can use these concepts to build, to understand natural systems and to build artificial systems. And anyone can think of examples of fragile, robust, or antifragile systems. Well, it was mentioned already in the chat that a virus can be seen as a perturbation. So we can see that the pandemic is like a good example where we can see how robust fragile or antifragile different systems are. So antifragile systems were those, well, for this precise perturbation of SARS-CoV-2, and the antifragile systems were those that benefit from it. So it was pharmaceutical companies that made vaccines. They got huge benefits from it. Also, producers of face masks. Who else? Not many people, but well, probably you saw this data that the richest people in the world became way richer during these 2 years. So they also benefit from this. Yeah, so Sophia writes, video conference software, in general, anyone benefiting from the changes of lifestyle that we had, you could say that they were antifragile. And those that lost, you could say that they were fragile, like the restaurant businesses or all the economies that were perturbed. And those that were more or less the same, you could say that they were robust. So then the question is, okay, how can we design systems so that, I mean, we'll keep on having this type of perturbations more and more often. And it can be because of viruses or because of migration or because of war or famine, of climate change. So how can we design systems that perhaps will not benefit from all these changes, but at least they will not be negatively destroyed, meaning that they are not fragile, or at least not as fragile as they are now. Why? Because this basically being better prepared to things that of course, we don't know when they will happen or how they will happen, but we know we will have perturbations. So looking at systems in this very abstract way allows us to prepare better for these unpredictable events simply by building more robust systems. And of course, we will also need adaptation for when these unforeseen changes materialize, and then we will be able to know, oh, we need to do this, but at least we will have some buffering time to let's say, to limit the effects of these perturbations. So, Odin asks, do you think from the examples that antifragility implies memory, adaptation to variable environment, plasticity in the case of biological entities? I think memory can be useful for many things, not only antifragility, but I think you could also have antifragility without memory. Yeah, I mean, these random Euler networks don't have memory, and they can also be antifragile. I mean, in general, memory kind of allows you to have more complex functions. So that can be beneficial in many different cases. But it's more complex than antifragility memory, and that's it. But yes, antifragility, you could say that requires adaptation. As antifragile system requires adaptation because you have a change, and this change will improve the system, but that improvement has to be through adaptation. But you already have like the mechanisms inbuilt to benefit from that perturbation that you have them already, but then those will lead to the changes such that will benefit the system. So I think we also mentioned Hopfield networks, that if you add a bit of noise, they classify better. So you could say that they are antifragile. And also in some search algorithms for certain search problems, if you add a bit of noise, then you kick them out of local optima. So it will allow you to find better the global optima easier. But how much noise, it depends on the algorithm and the problem and many other things. It's all of this is very contextual. So yeah, it's like no free lunch. So in the next classes, on Thursday, we will see the slower is faster effect. And on Tuesday, I'll already put the coursework in Google Classroom. So for next Tuesday, please share with us your final project ideas. So the classwork, basically in less than 500 words, share your idea. And here, without slides, just like tell us about what you would like to do. And then we can give you feedback like, yeah, it's great, carry on, or maybe it's too ambitious, try to have some preliminary results for the course and then continue for, let's say, a project with a longer time frame. Because I think this project should be ready by the end of May, if I'm not mistaken. End of May or early June. I'll check. So are there any more questions? So the details of the final project, the idea is to have something like a paper you could send to a conference proceedings. I think maximum 3,000 words. And the idea is that it should have the structure like introduction, background, methods, results, conclusion, references, and those from the master's program in computer engineering, the idea is to have a simulation of a system and then, let's say, present the results that you got with that simulation. And for those who don't have programming experience, then you don't need to program. People from the physics graduate program, it can be a simulation, but it can also be a mathematical model, which at the end most probably will need to implement in software. But let's say the focus is not on the programming side, but let's say on extending some of the concepts that we have seen during the course, and to apply it to one topic of your choice. It's very valid if it's something that you are interested or working on, if it can help you with a thesis you are working with, or another project or your work, then it's great. Yeah. And if not, it's also great. Okay, so see you on Thursday. Enjoy the week.
Thank you.